This is Eye of the Storm, a St. John's video series presented by NOBULL. All right, the Red Storm, they come into this week playing some of their best basketball of the season, showing more consistency, better execution, and a clearer identity than we saw earlier in the year with a 3-game winning streak in hand and a critical Big East road test at Villanova, followed by a home date against Seton Hall. This feels like an important moment for St. John's to measure how real this progress is. To help us break it all down, I'm joined by the best New York Post St. John's beat writer and a familiar face here on Eye of the Storm, my guy, Zach Braziller. Zach, what's going on, man?
What's up, man? How are you?
I'm doing good. We are now in the thick of conference play here, which I know is an exciting time for you. A lot going on in college sports, particularly college basketball. Feels like good times for the Johnnies. You and I saw the game the other night where they beat Marquette, and it feels really good about them. So I'll ask you this, because 3-game win streak for the Johnnies right now. What stands out to you the most about how St. John's is winning right now as opposed to earlier in the season?
It's the big lineup. I mean, that's the change. You know, like going to Dylan Mitchell in the starting lineup with Bryce Hopkins and Zuby Ejiofor. Nobody in this league outside of UConn could really handle that front court. And, you know, we've seen that with beat Butler at Butler by 14, wasn't even that close. Won at Creighton by 17, it really wasn't that close. And then they beat Marquette by 24. So it's been 3 dominant performances, and the big stat is defensive rebound, because that has been, you know, everyone's been has talked that they don't have a true point guard, this and that, and that's obviously a thing. But the defensive rebound, when you look at all their losses, has absolutely killed them. And these last 3 games, the defensive rebound, their defensive rebound percentage is over 81%. They've gone from 310th in the country in defensive rebounding possession percentage to 238. That's a big jump in 3 games. Right. And Butler, of the 3, Butler's really the only good offensive rebounding team. I think they're about top 30 in the country. You know, Creighton's not great. Marquette's okay. But that's been a big thing. Dylan Mitchell in this stretch has been awesome. Kind of been the player we thought St. John's was getting. He's an NBA athlete. Can't really shoot, you know, from distance, but if he could, he would have been in the league 2 years ago. He's that good of an athlete. In this stretch, he's averaging 7 points, 8 rebounds, 4 assists, just 1 turnover, kind of playing that point forward position that we talked about early in the year. They've leaned into the strength. You know, you throw in Ruben Prey there too, where he's played a little with Zuby Ejiofor, and they've gone to more 3-forward lineups. We know they, outside of those Sellers, they really don't have difference-making guards right now.
Yeah.
But they have difference makers up front.
Yeah.
And they're leaning into that. And, you know, it'll be interesting because now, look, I think there's a clear top 4 in the Big East. UConn, St. John's, Villanova, and Seton Hall. You want to throw Creighton in there, I guess you can, but that to me is the top 4. And now they go to Villanova Saturday night. Seton Hall comes in. You know, it's a chance to kind of really show, hey, we're closer to being on that UConn level than that next level. And look, they played much better here. And you know, you can even go back. Look, they had a nice win at Georgetown where they really dominated the second half.
Yep.
You throw that Providence game now looks kind of like an anomaly. You know, now I do think Providence is as disappointing as they've been. They're one of the few teams in the league that actually can match St. John's athletically. And so I think that now St. John's couldn't make a shot in that game and fell apart late. But that game feels more like an anomaly when you look at how they've played. I mean, they're 5-1 in the league, and all 5 wins have been kind of in dominant fashion. They've all been double figures. None of them were really like up for grabs the last 10 minutes. So that Providence game feels like an anomaly. And yeah, I think you should feel pretty good about how they're playing right now.
Yeah, coming out of that Providence game, you wondered, hey, where's this team going to go from here? That was some of the questions there. But you talked about the big lineup here. But when you look at this recent success for St. John's, we talk about the last 3 games, how much of that is tied to lineup flexibility that they may have now versus players simply settling into more clearly defined roles? Like, how do you view that?
Well, the thing I like about the big lineup is the versatility. I mean, all 4 forwards, when I'm including Ruben Prey in this, can guard on the perimeter. So they can switch everything. And outside of Mitchell, the other 3 guys all can shoot threes. Now, Zuby Ejiofor is not necessarily like a knockdown 3-point shooter, but he can make a 3. Hopkins can make threes. Ruben Prey can make threes. And so it's a big lineup kind of with a twist where, like, most teams go big, you create mismatches on one end, but then you're facing mismatches. They're not really dealing with that. I mean, this past game, you had Dylan Mitchell guarding a lot Marquette's star freshman point guard, Nigel James. And, like, staying with him. Like, their big guys can really guard on the perimeter, especially Mitchell, Zuby, and Prey, and that's just such an advantage because teams, you've seen it. They've been just doubling up teams in points in the paint. Hopkins has played better. He's been more aggressive. He's got to stop getting in foul trouble. We've seen that 2 out of the last 3. But, their combination of physicality, athleticism, versatility with those big lineups is a big thing.
Yeah, it's been huge for them, and fans can definitely see that. From your perspective, when you look at this recent stretch, right, this recent surge, if you want to call it that, what do you think is the most sustainable part of it, right? Is it, are we looking at the defense, the rebounding, 2 things you've highlighted there? Is it the shot selection? Is this something else? What's most sustainable from what you've seen St. John's, not just even in these 3 games, they've won 8 out of the last 10. What's been the most sustainable thing?
To me, it's the defense because they've been good defensively. The issue wasn't defense for most of the year. It's the defensive rebound. You could be a good defense team, but if you don't close out possessions, it doesn't matter. Last year's team was so great. They weren't a great defensive rebound team last year either. I think they were around 180 in the country, but they were so good defensively, they kind of made up for it. This year's team is not as good defensively. It's good enough. But if you don't close out defensive possessions, it doesn't matter. That to me is, look, teams are going to zone them. We've seen it some. Mm-hmm. Teams are going to zone them. I would expect Villanova to do that plenty. Because that big lineup, you don't have a ton of shooting. Teams are fine with Zuby Ejiofor taking 3s because that means he's not in the paint. Bryce Hopkins teams are going to say, fine, you want to beat us from deep, go ahead, and Mitchell's not really going to shoot 3s. So, that's the one thing teams are going to combat is like, all right, you want to play big, we're going to zone you. Now, the one thing about zoning is when you zone, it's harder to defensive rebound. Yep. And St. John's, I believe, is 22nd in the country in offensive rebounding possession. They're a really good offensive rebounding team, and that's another bonus of that big lineup is they're really good on the glass. I think it's the defensive rebounding because that's all year we've harped on it. They beat Iowa State if they can defensive rebound down the stretch. Alabama, they have a better shot to win if they defensive rebound. The Auburn game turned because defensive rebounding. Kentucky, all these, Providence, they got crushed on the defensive glass in the second half. All these games they lost. You can say, well, the offense, this, and the guarding the ball and all that stuff. But if they would have defensive rebounded better, they have at least 2 more wins, in my opinion.
Some people may look at this, and I do like the lineup change and the versatility that you've talked about with it. Do you have any concern about how they may be able to handle teams that are maybe really quick or have quick guards, like we saw with them against Alabama? That's a game that jumps out to me there. Not too many teams like Alabama in their backcourt and their speed, but is that a concern with this big lineup that we're seeing from St. John's?
Yeah. I mean, look, they clearly struggle dealing with dynamic quick guards.
Right.
There's no question about that. Villanova has a really good freshman point guard, Akaden Lewis, who St. John's recruited, kind of probably backed off the end, but he's a really, he's not scoring a ton, but he's playing really well, gets a lot of assists, gets in the lane, he's super long. That's definitely something to keep an eye on because they don't have that, their best perimeter defenders are probably Dylan Mitchell.
Yeah.
It's probably their best. I think Ozai Sellers has definitely defended better lately. But their best perimeter is probably Dylan Mitchell. And they tried putting him on the Alabama guards and didn't work out great. There's no question about that. I also, as we get later in the year and especially the NCAA tournament, and you face some of those guys, I wouldn't be surprised if you see the matchup zone. I don't think there's any doubt about that because they, when you look at those losses, that's the defensive rebounding, the inability to stop a really dynamic guard. Alabama, Auburn, not as much Iowa State as though they have a really good point guard, but that wasn't quite as much of an issue. Kentucky, obviously, with Jalon Lowe, who basically hasn't played since that game. That's clear. That's a clear issue is guarding a dynamic lead guard. But guess what? Most teams don't do that well either.
That is true. That is more than a fair point. Now, look, the fans know one thing that we've seen with this team this season at times, long periods where they are unable to put up points. What areas do you think St. John's needs to be sharp in to avoid these long scoring droughts? Because we've seen this with this team. It can happen. How do they get better at that? Where do you think they need to be more sharp to avoid these scoring droughts?
Yeah, the offense the last few games have been really good.
Yeah.
And a lot of that, look, Ozias Sellers, when he scores in double figures, they're 7-2. And he's the guy, when the first few shots go in, he gets a lot of confidence. When they don't, he sometimes gets hesitant, but he's the best shooter on the team. He's been really good of late. He's coming off a 24-point game. He didn't play a lot the other day, but left Terrace Leotopoulos really gave them a boost in the Butler and Creighton games. Marquette really wasn't a good matchup for him because they're a little too quick and athletic. But I think Villanova, that plays slow, you'll see more of him. He's a guy who could really make shots. It's going to come down to making shots because teams are going to look to take away the inside.
Yeah.
We saw it with Creighton, where Zubi Ejiofor didn't score a ton. He had 6 assists, and 5 of them were for 3-pointers. St. John's has to make shots. Teams are going to zone them. They're going to double in the post, and they need to make shots. And look, they have guys, Leotopoulos, Sellers, Ian Jackson, Josan Sanin, Dylan Darling has shot the ball much better of late. So they have guys who make shots. If they make shots, it creates it's going to force the opposition to kind of say, all right, well, are we going to give up threes or are we going to give up twos? Creighton basically dared St. John's to beat them from deep, and they did. They had 12 threes. Marquette was a little different. Marquette, there was a lot of single coverage on Zuby inside, which surprised me. Really, Sellers was the only guy who made threes in that game. But look, they're just under 36% from 3 on the season, which is really good. They're around 40 from 3 in Big East play, number 1 in the conference. They've shot the ball, for the most part, pretty well outside of a few bad ones, Providence, Kentucky. So they've shot the ball pretty well. But yeah, they got to make shots. Because if they don't, teams are just going to double and sag off in the post. But for the most part, what we're seeing in league play as teams are doubling the big guys is they've been pretty consistent shooting the ball.
They have, and you mentioned Sellers. He's been fantastic shooting the ball lately, been on a bit of a heater there, so he's been really good. Want to look ahead to the Villanova matchup on Saturday. What are the specific matchup challenges that could give the Johnnies issues at the Wells Fargo Center on Saturday night? Nova's a good team. You called them a top 4 team in the conference. Yeah. What challenges do they present for St. John's here?
The point guard Lewis, he's super athletic. He's super long. He gets in the lane. A lot of what they do is based off his penetration, and they have shooter. They have usually have 3 or 4 guys who can shoot threes. It's going to be covering the 3-point line, and they did after a shaky start at Creighton, they did a great job defending the 3. I believe Creighton started 6 of 10, and then was something like maybe 3 of 15 the rest of the game. So they really defended the 3 well against Creighton after a bad start, and that's going to be big here because Villanova likes to shoot a lot of threes. They have guys who make threes. Bryce Lindsey's a terrific 3-point shooter. Tyler Perkins makes threes. Lewis doesn't take as many and hasn't shot it great, but he can make threes. Matt Hodge, they have guys who can shoot threes, and that to me is, if you could hold them under 10-11, I think St. John's wins.
All right, hold them under 10-11, made threes for the game. Could be good for the Johnnies there. Now, following Nova, another good test. St. John's, they come back home. They face Seton Hall. Pirates, they cracked the top 25 earlier this week. Here's my question for you. How good are the Seton Hall Pirates, and how tough of a test do you think they will be for the Johnnies?
Seton Hall is like a poor man's St. John's last year.
Huh.
They play incredibly hard. They don't ever think a game is over. They're tough. They rebound. They defend. They're very short on talent. They're ranked 133rd in offensive efficiency in the country. They are the worst 3-point shooting team in the conference in league play, worst 2-point shooting team in the conference in league play. They had 1-3 the other night against UConn. They're going to get after you. They're going to press. They're going to do everything that St. John's team did last year. The only difference is they didn't have a Kadari Richmond. They don't have a Kadari Richmond or R.J. Lewis.
Right.
Or even a Zubi Ejiofor.
Yeah.
They have, they're good. I don't know if it's a good matchup for Seton Hall, for St. John's. I think this is a good matchup for St. John's. Now, for a few reasons. Number one, Seton Hall likes to really pressure you with the guards. St. John's is just going to give the ball to their forwards to bring the ball up. So is Seton Hall going to have their guards pressing Dylan Mitchell and Bryce Hopkins? They should be able to look over them and throw over them. And the one thing about St. John's is they're really good in transition. So St. John's beats that press. You're looking at open threes. You're looking at dunks. You know, and, you know, Seton Hall, especially with the way Seton Hall is a good offensive rebounding team, but the way St. John's is rebounding more lately, you know, Seton Hall has to scrap, is going to scrap. They're going to need second chances. They're going to need turnovers. And St. John's right now is leading the conference in league play in turnovers forced and turnovers committed. They've really taken care of the ball well.
Yep.
You know, so look, it's not going to be easy. Seton Hall plays hard. They're not going to get blown out. But I just don't know if they have the talent to beat St. John's, especially at the Garden. You know, they gave UConn a really tough game in New York the other night. They were down big, came back. But yeah, I mean, they do remind me of St. John's last year. Just not nearly as good, but
right,
like
not as talented.
Not as talented,
yeah.
not as good. But they remind me of that team where they play so hard. You know, they never think a game is over. They're just going to play as hard as they possibly can for 40 minutes. Shaheen Lowry's done a great job. I think they're going to make the tournament. I do. I think there are going to be 4 tournament teams in this league, the 4 teams I mentioned. So yeah, no, it'll be interesting to watch this game on Tuesday.
Yeah, it should be a good one there on Tuesday at the Garden. You know the Pirates fans are going to be in there. Johnnies fans will be in the building at MSG. So will Zach and I will be in the building as well, too. Last thing for me, Zach, I want to look a little big picture here because we talked about this at the beginning of the season and expectations. But if St. John's continues playing some of the good basketball, right, that we've seen over these last 10 games or so, if we see that through the rest of January, how does that reshape expectations, particularly among the fan base, for February and beyond?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, when they had that shaky non-conference, and especially after they lost to Providence, my kind of thing was like, just make the tournament. You know, that should be the focus. You know, this program hasn't made back-to-back tournaments in over 25 years. And now these last 3 games, they've looked the part again. This is probably the best they've looked since Vegas, when they should have beat Iowa State or nearly beat Iowa State, and then they crushed a decent Baylor team the next day. These last 3 games are the best they've looked since those games. And you could argue they've even looked better because the defensive rebound is better, and the defense is better, and the 3-4 lineup has really paid off. You know, I think if you continue to win here, I think you could say like a second weekend should be the goal. But it's, you know, you got to see. I mean, look, I still stand that if they make the tournament and they win a game, yes, it would be slightly disappointing because of the preseason rankings, but it's still St. John's. And, you know, it's still, you know, it would still be overall, when you look at 2 years, overall 2 years be a good, productive, good stretch. I know fans are going to say, well, we started number 5. We should have been a Final Four team or an Elite 8 team or whatever. But, like, the thing is, you never know how the bracket, you know, breaks. I mean, last year they got a brutal draw in the second round.
Yep. An
Arkansas team that really wasn't a 10 seed and matched up. It was a brutal matchup for them this year. You know what? Let's say they're like a 6 seed and they end up playing a 3 seed. They can beat. I mean, and then you never know. Like you really, that's the thing about like the tournament. You just don't know how things are going to work. To me, right now, the goal has to be. I think they could get up to being around 5 seed, maybe a 4 if they beat UConn once. Obviously, a 4 would be awesome. I think they would sign for that right now. But, yeah, look, I don't think going 17-3, 16-4 in this league is out of the question. I don't. I mean, especially the way they're playing now, especially what we've seen out of this league. These next 2 games are big. You know, if they win these next 2 games, you're most likely they're not going to lose again until that UConn game on February 6th, which would now be huge. So these next 2 are very interesting, especially Saturday night. I think they'll beat Seton Hall. But Saturday night, Villanova is, you know, the spread will probably be somewhat even. I think that's going to be a really, really big game. And it's a game, you know, you win that game, and now I think you really have confidence that this team has turned the corner.
Hey, St. John's fans, they want that confidence. They're still going to be confident. You're right. They get up to like a 4 seed, possibly. You're right. A lot has to happen.
4 or 5.
4 or 5. Fans are still going to have some expectations. They're going to want more than 1 win in the tournament.
Yeah, and that's fair. I'm not saying they shouldn't.
Right.
I'm not saying they shouldn't.
What was your pick at the beginning of the year? What'd you have?
I think Elite 8.
Yeah, I think I remember that. See, I told you, they're gonna come for you, Zach. They're gonna come for you. They're gonna remember that. Zach picked them to go to the Elite Eight. We want to see. However, the reason I asked that question, just to be fair to everybody, is that things can change during the season. Expectations can change too. So don't jump on Zach because expectations can change and you can shift, and we'll see. Anything can happen though.
Here's the thing, like I said before, it's all about March. Like they're obviously gonna be in the tournament. I said this, it was all about March. Like if you lose a few games you didn't want to lose during the regular season, like no one's going to care if you have a big March.
Fair. That's a great point.
Like it's all about March. And like kind of like the Knicks last year where they didn't have a great regular season, but they had a very good postseason. Nobody cared about the regular season. It stinks to say because it's like, well, so you're saying like the 4 months before it mean nothing, and then it's all comes down to 1 or 2 games, but it's kind of the way it is.
But it's what you're evaluated on, right? The things that happen before matter to build to get there, right? With building good habits, the change in the lineup, all that's part of the story. But at the end of the day, you're going to be evaluated by what happens in March. We'll see.
Fair.
We'll see where the Johnnies are in March. But for now, they got a big game on Saturday against Villanova. Then Tuesday, Seton Hall at the Garden. Zach and I will be there. That is the great Zach Braziller, St. John's beat writer for us here at the New York Post. I'm Dexter Henry. Thanks for watching another edition of Eye of the Storm.